This program, of course, is presented by Pro Wrestling Illustrated, the most widely read, widely sold, and respected wrestling magazine in the world today.
This is the Pro Wrestling Illustrated podcast. I'm your host, PWI senior writer Al Castle, welcoming you to the PWI annual office Christmas party, and joined as always by my co-host Brian Solomon. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing okay. I'm having fun at the Christmas party.
Yes. Don't get too drunk. Hold on, let me get in the mood here. I got my Santa hat for those watching.
There's no Xerox machine nearby.
And also joined by the boss, PWI editor-in-chief, Kevin McElvaney. How are you?
Doing well. I'm here in my very unorganized office space at the moment. So
not looking too festive over there.
No, don't pay attention to the background. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, I think it's best we keep this virtual because the actual PWI offices look a little
If to quote Lenny Leonard of The Simpsons, don't tell people how I live.
And then finally, fellow senior writer Harry Burkett joining us once again. How's it going, Harry?
Pretty good. I'm just glad to have survived and reached the end of 2020.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to be looking back on 2020 on this episode. That's why we gathered everybody here. A crazy year in general for all of us, maybe even in particular a crazy year for wrestling. And not just because of the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic had a lot to do with what a wild year it was. As I said, we're going to be looking back, looking ahead some to 2021. Just giving our thoughts very quickly. Let's not do kind of traditional plugs because we got you all here. Don't want to waste too much time, but you do want to go to pwi-online.com for the latest issue. Features the tag team 50, first ever ranking of the top 50 tag teams in all of wrestling, and it's still time to subscribe or give a gift to the wrestling fan in your life. Give them a subscription to PWI. You can do that anytime. And we're going to be talking here about 2020. And before long, the year in wrestling is going to be out. And that's going to include all our awards as voted by you, the PWI readers. We're not going to discuss those here, but that's definitely something you're going to want to pick up. So again, PWI-online.com. Also go to ProWrestlingTees.com. There's some good gift ideas there in the way of PWI t-shirts. Follow us on social media at official PWI on Twitter and Instagram. Find us on Facebook, on YouTube, where we're, I believe, going to be uploading this. And so that out of the way, let's talk about 2020. What a weird year, again, in general, and certainly for pro wrestling. I'd say highs and lows. I feel like more lows than highs, but the highs were pretty high. I mean, it's weird, at least talking as far as WWE on a year where, Brian, you and I have talked about, in some ways, the worst WWE product in a generation in overall, also featured some of the very best performances in a generation. When you talk about the work Roman Reigns has done, you talk about the work that Sasha Banks and Bayley have done over the year. And there were other performers who had a standout year. But again, it comes in the middle of just what feels like a complete mess of a product. Certainly highlighted this past weekend. I mean, what kind of a perfect ending to WWE's product that the last pay-per-view of the year on Christmas week ends with a murder in the ring. I'd call it the worst angle in WWE history, but I think there's some contenders even this year. It's not even the second time a wrestler was murdered to end a pay-per-view this year. It's not even right. So it's the third time, right? So we've had 3 WWE pay-per-views end with someone being killed this year. This was the most graphic of all. Randy Orton setting Bray Wyatt on fire in the middle of the ring. And as I touched on, ending a show that was otherwise really strong, with some really terrific performances and matches throughout. Overall, what kind of year did WWE have in 2020? Is there any reason for optimism going into 2021, Brian?
First of all, I think that what you point out really kind of says a lot, because it's not really something that falls on the performers. Because I think that, WWE has some great workers right now. I mean, it's been said, but they have like this fantasy roster. It's just unbelievable, the talent that they've got. But I think it falls more on the creative side. I think they had a tough time adapting to the pandemic, number one, although I love the Thunderdome concept. I think they had a tough time. They've had a tough time for sure adapting to real competition, because if I'm not mistaken, I think 2020 was the first full year, right, of AEW and WWE going head to head, because they kind of started in the middle of 2019. So I think they've sort of had to scramble a bit. A lot of people have said like, okay, you've had the worst Raw rating, in the history of the show, and this is the show you come back with to try to come back from that. You know what I mean? Like they still don't seem to have that fire under them. Everybody talks about that speech that the McMahons gave, which now seems like 8 million years ago, where they were like, we've heard you and we're going to do better and blah, blah, blah. And it just seems to have changed nothing. So that kind of thing can be a little demoralizing, but there's been a lot to love in WWE this year. The Roman Reigns tribal chief stuff is some of the best character work that I've seen anybody do, in WWE or anywhere. It's great stuff. It's stuff that they should be proud of. I think the NXT women's division still, even though, NXT for me has lost a step or two, the NXT women's division is still, for my money, the best women's division in wrestling still. I mean, talent wise and storyline wise, just they really have it all together in a way that a lot of places don't seem to be able to do. So, I mean, there's good and there's bad. And it's just a weird year. Maybe it'll be kind of like a mulligan. And once things, knock wood, go back to normal again, we can sort of, give everybody another chance to sort of regroup and say, okay, we know this knocked you off your game, and let's see what you could do now that we have the crowds back and everything's back to normal. I mean, I don't know how long that's even going to take, but we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real question, is how much, there's so much optimism for 2021, and it's somewhat merited, but it's going to be a while at least before we're done essentially with what 2020 is, right? I mean, I think for at least the first several months of 2021 are going to look a lot like 2020,
right?
And maybe
and
worse
also,
in some ways.
Not to interrupt, sorry, Al, but the other thing I forgot to mention too is the whole Drew McIntyre experiment. Mm-hmm. It still feels like the jury's out. It's this weird limbo of, is he over or not? Is it working or not? Is very hard to tell. I'm glad that, I don't know what was the deal with that little Orton switch they did, but I'm glad they came to their senses and kind of put it back on him. But, now with Roman and the tribal chief angle, the WWE championship is back to feeling like the secondary title again. So, he's sort of at that other disadvantage too. And that might be something that live crowds could make a difference on, because I still wonder, as great as the Roman Reigns stuff has been, what would the live crowd response be? Would they still be like, nah, we still don't want this guy. Screw you. We don't like, we you can do whatever you want. We still don't like him. Or would they say, yes, this is what we finally wanted from Roman Reigns? And we don't know. We just don't know.
Yeah, I thought about that too. And I thought about that some watching TLC, that there are some performers, matches that have benefited from not necessarily not having a crowd there, but having the fake crowd there, because WWE has been able to kind of inject the reaction that they want for some characters. I thought that somewhat with the Carmela Sasha Banks match, which was a fine match, but I think it was actually helped by all the fake enthusiasm from the Thunderdome, and it kind of elevated the match. But Harry, we should talk more about Drew McIntyre. I mean, when you think about who was made, or at least was tried to be made in 2020, that's the one you point to, and start at the very beginning of the year with him winning the Royal Rumble. Literally this time last year, he was kind of this mid-card afterthought, and then they strapped that proverbial rocket pack on his back in January. And again, as Brian touched on it, it's sort of hard to tell how well he's doing. Sort of just speaking objectively, I think he's doing fine. I mean, he looks like he belongs. He has delivered a string of worthwhile main event performances. What do you make of the Roman Reigns experiment in 2020?
You mean Drew McIntyre?
I'm sorry, yes, Drew McIntyre.
Yeah, okay. Yes. Actually, it's funny, when I interviewed Diamond Dallas Page earlier in the year, and we were talking about wrestling with no live crowds, Drew McIntyre was the first name that he brought up by saying that, Drew was kind of bummed out. Here I am, WWE champion. I'm headlining WrestleMania, but there are no people here. And one quote Dallas gave me, which I didn't include that in my column. I can't believe I forgot it. He said Drew was the Sean Connery of WWE. And you know what? That really makes a lot of sense. He's very handsome. He's even got the dimples. And when he does these Drew and A's with the Hollywood celebrities, he seems like he's totally at home. So I think he has that bankable Hollywood star power that Vince loves and that really crosses over. So I think even if he has some stumbles along the way, I think Vince is going to keep with him for the long haul. And I like him as the sophisticated suit-wearing champion, not so much the Scottish beast. I thought he came across very well when he and Roman Reigns had the contract signing on SmackDown. And to me, that was one of the best exchanges of the year. I don't believe a table was broken. Am I correct in that?
I cannot vouch for that.
Yeah, I love the idea that sort of that whole thing by WWE standards was understated. It was just a conversation between two alpha males representing their different brands. And it kind of goes into the Roman Reigns thing that you were talking about earlier. I think one reason that's compelling is, well, it's hard to use the word understated. It started out as understated, but it has a lot of layers to it. And that's something that WWE audiences don't get very often. And I think Drew is the kind of performer who can deliver those kinds of storylines on his own, like Roman Reigns-like storylines, like you would see in a movie. So I think 2021 is going to be a very good year for him, even though I suspect a year from now, our conversation will be very similar to today, where we're still talking about the pandemic, not having large crowds, and the economy still recovering. So I think we're in a holding pattern until 2022. And so is Drew.
Yeah. Kevin, Drew kind of being the exception, it is hard. And even there, maybe it's not the exception. It's hard to pinpoint where WWE made a lot of stars in 2020. When you look at who is in the upper tier mix, what WrestleMania it's probably going to look like next year. What are the faces are going to factor in? You're talking Bray Wyatt and Randy Orton and Roman Reigns. Kind of the same cast of characters with Drew thrown in there. He's kind of the new face. But what kind of grade do you give WWE in 2020, just in terms of elevating people? And, we've seen wrestlers who we had high hopes for, Keith Lee, Matt Riddle, both called up, neither factoring that much into anything these days. Big E still kind of on his way. He gets in an Intercontinental title shot, I believe, this Friday night. And, there's reason for optimism there. But big picture, how did WWE do in 2020 in terms of creating stars, elevating talent?
So that's tough because ultimately it's going to come down to that crowd reaction in some way. Though I suspect people are going to get behind the likes of Drew McIntyre, because if you look at when WWE, with some exceptions, when WWE, and I mean notable exceptions, it took people a long time to accept John Cena. They arguably never accepted Roman Reigns. But someone like a Randy Orton, when they were really persistent in pushing him back in the day, it made a star out of him. And I think they're kind of in that situation now with McIntyre. But other than that, I mean, I don't know what grade I would give, because there wasn't a whole lot of minting new stars going on. It was just finding new ways to use people who have been reliable in the past. So your Roman Reigns, Bayley and Sasha. And I mean, even if you look at the Hurt Business, who I think are really on the cusp of something special, arguably Lashley is at a level in WWE right now that he hasn't been before, or I think there's at least the perception of that. He and along with him, of course, you have MVP, who was, a non-factor before. I believe, was it maybe late 2019 when he reappeared, but wasn't. No, actually, it was the Royal Rumble.
The Rumble, so
it was this year. Yeah, so entirely this year. I think that faction is going to be a big deal in 2021. No two ways about that. The whole retribution thing's a little bit awkward. I think Mustafa Ali has, a lot of potential in whatever role you want to put him in, but the whole booking of that, the fact that the faction was seen as, sort of silly out of the gate, I think he lends credibility to it, but I don't think the costumes and the strange names have done any favors for the other wrestlers who were involved there, who are all very talented. So, yeah, it's kind of tricky. I think right now, I think they've done some creative things and they've done some outside of the box things for better and for worse because they could and because they had to. They didn't have that guidance of the live crowd, which, I mean, a blessing and a curse, really, because it allowed them to try some different things that they might not have otherwise, but it didn't always work.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Retribution, which I had forgotten about, and it speaks to how well it did or didn't do. I mean, to me, it was a complete bust, a disaster, almost kind of modern day gobbledygooker territory, just how poorly envisioned and executed it's been, I think has set back all the talent that is involved in it. Not that they can't get past it, but I think there were, you look at Miliam or Donovan Dijakovic, these were talents with big upsides who I think have taken a step back and sizable step back because they were in that gimmick. But you look at that, Brian, you look at stuff like a Raw Underground. There were a lot of big swings and misses by WWE in 2020.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing, that the fact that we didn't even mention Retribution kind of says it all. Just the way, I mean, because there was potential there. If they had made it a straight up angle where you had either talent that had just been let go or talent that was being misused, and they were just continuing their, personas that people knew and recognized, I think that would have been a much bigger success. I think the death knell of that, I mean, it was poorly executed from the beginning, but the death knell of it was, I think, when they said at one point, well, they're only going to be on Raw. And we're just like, okay, so what, their company Invasion is just confined to like one show and not the, it just spoke to the artifice of the whole thing, and it really deflated it. And I think it was
and not to interrupt, Brian, but when they got drafted,
yes.
Why would any show want them?
Right. They said, okay, these guys that are trying to destroy our company, we're going to give them a chance and see what they can do. That did that. And also there was one member, and I'm blanking now, who actually, to her credit, asked to be removed, right, from the angle and not be a part.
Oh, was Martinez?
Mercedes Martinez. Yeah,
yes, Mercedes Martinez. Thank you. Yes. That was a bold and I think smart move. I mean, I hope she's not punished for it. I don't know what's going to come out of that.
There's no retribution.
Yeah, so Retribution. What was the other thing too that we
Raw Underground?
Oh, right, which died kind of a very ignominious and quiet death.
Yeah,
and it just I think, as I've said before, Shane is a big MMA guy, and I think that he, I'm pretty sure he was a big creative impetus behind that, and they gave it a shot. I think if it was anybody but his idea, they probably wouldn't have even done that. That's one of those things that's like future wrestle crap kind of stuff. Yeah. And it's funny because we talk about how a lot of the stuff that used to be considered wrestle crap is now loved by a large segment of the fan base. But not this. I think this, we can all agree, like fans of all ages and demographics can unite in just the WTF of Raw Underground, right? So
I would say that, but I don't think that's true. Yeah. Well, again, when I do these live tweets on pay-per-views, I've really tried to kind of tone it down in recent years and be a lot more diplomatic. And so I keep like I try to keep my most controversial opinions to myself and only put stuff out there that I feel like, all right, I feel like I'm pretty safe saying this. And again, the finish of the pay-per-view on Sunday with Randy Orton setting Bray Wyatt on fire, I'm like, okay, I feel like pretty good about the whole world is going to think this is stupid. And I put it out there and, again, this was the year that I feel like I just I don't belong anymore. I am so out of touch with a generation of wrestling fans, and maybe that's a good segue to the next conversation. Is how many part of it I think was brought out by the pandemic, right? Because of the pandemic, we saw a lot of innovation in wrestling in 2020 for the better and for the worse. Stuff like Thunderdome, I think, was absolutely visionary. I think WWE led all of major sports in terms of accommodating for not having fans there, and I think they borrowed from different sports. The NBA had the bubble, and they had some screens in the back. But when WWE unveiled the Thunderdome, it was really super impressive, and they absolutely deserve an A+ for that. But then we saw other ways that they had to think outside the box and account for not having live fans there. One thing we saw, Harry, you and I wrote about this in our top 10 stories. I don't want to say the birth of the cinematic match, but really the surge of the cinematic match for better or for worse. And again, WrestleMania, both the Boneyard match, the first time a wrestler was murdered at the end of a pay-per-view, and the Firefly Funhouse match at the end of both of those. And I've said I've changed my tune some on the Boneyard match, not at all on the Firefly Funhouse match. But again, I saw Firefly Funhouse and I thought, there's no way anyone in the world thinks this is good. And boy, was I wrong. So, sorry, guys. Talk a bit about that, Harry. Some of the innovation, some of the new way of presenting wrestling in 2020. At the end of the day, is it a net positive or a negative?
I'm going to admit that I'm out of touch.
Yeah,
I was out of touch even when I was a teenager. I wanted Ole Anderson to be NWA champion. That's how out of touch I was. But today, I have to say, I'm just going to say this in brutal honesty. And I hate saying this because when I hear people saying there's so much about wrestling they don't like, I always say, well, maybe it's time to get out. Maybe it's time to stop watching. I hate cinematic matches. They're not wrestling matches. They're movies. They're action sequences. And I just can't get into them.
Were there any that you liked?
What's that?
Were there any that you liked?
None.
No?
Just because I don't buy the concept. I even didn't like Money in the Bank when they're running up, Titan Tower in Stanford to get to the top of the building. Because they're so over the top, like the Boneyard match between Undertaker and AJ. But I give them credit for trying. There were some innovations, beyond the cinematic matches that I really didn't think I would like, but I really bought into. One was the Thunderdome concept. And I have to admit, once that came on the scene in August, I sort of forgot there was not a live crowd. So that really did work some magic for me. And I think in particular, WWE needed that. I can watch Ring of Honor with no crowd or Impact Wrestling with no crowd because I'm kind of used to watching those shows
because they never have a crowd.
Right.
No.
But WWE, their whole mindset, their storylines, the execution of the performers in the ring is so over the top. It begs for that large crowd. Whereas early on, I was hoping, I said, maybe they'll grasp the intimacy, and maybe really connect with their viewers with a toned down production, like WWE Power, something like that. But they're not capable of doing that. So Thunderdome, that was definitely a winner. And I guess we'll see at least remnants of that once the pandemic subsides. But one thing I'd like to point out is one thing that was really proven this year across the board was loyalty to pro wrestling, where wrestling fans did not hold the pandemic against their favorite promotions. And it runs from, investors who are really marveling at the brand loyalty to WWE by looking at their merchandise sales. And, this was their most profitable year ever. But it was across the board. Impact Wrestling fans loved Impact. Ring of Honor fans loved Ring of Honor. And I didn't see hardly any criticism of things that the industry could not help, So I think it made the connection between the fans and the industry a lot stronger.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think there was a lot of in lieu of fans cheering on at ringside, you really felt fans cheering on from home, all their wrestling companies. They wanted to see them succeed. I think there was a lot of kind of disillusionment when you saw some companies do the wrong things in the pandemic, not take the proper precautions. And at the end of the day, it was that, again, you wanted to see them get through this and thrive. But Kevin, on the topic of cinematic matches, there were some that I liked more than others. I think the ones that kept it within the parameters of wrestling somewhat, where we didn't stray too much in kind of the fantastical work. I think of the Gargano Ciampa match, which was just kind of a wrestling match, but shot in cinematic style. Do you think some of this is here to stay, and is that a good thing?
Yeah, no, I think that's a tool that's in the toolbox now. And now that WWE has seen it can be done and that it will be, popular to some extent, they're going to keep doing it. To your point, some of these work better than others. I think the Stadium Stampede match was really fun, a little silly, but if you're okay with that, like I am, then it works. And again, it was more just like, an empty arena brawl, which I actually think the Boneyard match, and despite the really over the top ending with, the murder, some things can't be avoided. But really that was a buried alive match is what it comes down to. No more ridiculous than that, just a different setting. And for the most part it was just a brawl. So I think that worked. And I think, going forward, it is something that's going to be used, especially when, down the line, if there's something like this again, where there has to be, God forbid, a quarantine, or there's fans can't be in attendance for whatever reason. And, don't want to speculate, but it would, it's a way that you can fill in some of the gaps. And I think, you're going to see WWE continue to do this, AEW do it, Impact to do it. I wouldn't expect, the Ring of Honors to the world to do it. I wouldn't ever think we'd see it over in New Japan, for example. But I think there's a place for it, and it's not to everyone's taste. And that's fine. Even something like, it's a context a lot of times. So like, if you look at some, and not just to offer my opinion on every single cinematic match, but something like the Firefly Funhouse match, which a lot of our staff just flat out hated. Mike Bessler said it was one of his favorite things he watched all year, but Mike is a very, different kind of.
What a shock.
So like, I enjoyed it. But I think promoting it as a match was a mistake. I think as a segment, it would have been really cool because it's up my alley in terms of what I watch outside of wrestling. The question of whether that's what I want from WWE all the time, So I think a lot of times it comes down to context and execution. I'll accept something and enjoy it under one circumstance, but then someone else does it in the wrong way, in the wrong context, bad execution, then it's no good. Even something like all the deletion matches with Matt Hardy and Impact, I hated those at first. I was really like, come on, like, what is this? This is ridiculous. Like, I like some campy stuff sometimes in wrestling, but it's, within the context of wrestling. And then like, I was just won over by it eventually because it was so well done. And if you look at it as being, are some of these things really that much more ridiculous than some of the backstage angles we've seen over the years? The ridiculous cliffhangers with, Raw going off the air with, you had Brian Pillman holding up Steve Austin at his house with a gun during, a very popular run for WWE. So much stuff during the Attitude Era, crucifixions, all sorts of kidnappings, just really
blowing up limousines.
Blowing up, well, that was a little bit later, but yeah, blowing up limousines. So it's, I don't know. It's not going to be to everybody's taste again, but I don't expect it to go away, especially not with World Wrestling Entertainment realizing that this is a different way they can present the product.
Yeah. One thing that, again, in terms of innovation, and some of this has to do with the cinematic matches and some of it doesn't, but Brian, you and I talked about this, really at the height of well, I shouldn't say the height because we might be in the height right now, but in the early months, when you're talking April, May, before they really figured out how to get fans back in to the arenas, the one thing that environment provided was this kind of lab settings for what could we do if we don't have fans here. How much can we experiment? And then we had something. I mean, what we had was post-production, right? I mean, Raw and even pay-per-views, even WrestleMania was taped in advance, which is unthinkable, right? And what that let them do is, take a cinematic approach in a different way, not in terms of presenting a match in a movie, but almost producing it like a movie in terms of shooting it again, shooting a scene again and again and again and again until you have the take that you like. And what that gave us was Edge versus Randy Orton, the greatest match of all time, lest we forget that bit of hype early in the year, which was, hyperbole behind hyperbole, but was also a really, really good match. And it was all that. It was being able to shoot different moves over and over again, pump in the crowd reaction you want. It was imperfect. I'd almost like to see that done again now, with everything that they've learned over the last 6-7 months. But one of my takeaways of 2020 was, does wrestling always need to be live? Brian, what do you think about that?
Well, I think you mean, well, yeah, there's a difference between live and I guess in front of people. There's so much energy that a show derives from the live crowd. That's the thing about pro wrestling, that I think there are benefits certainly to having no one there, but I feel like the advantages outweigh the benefits, the advantages of having people there and the energy that they provide to the show and just the feel of making things feel more special than they are. Wrestling is about illusion. And a lot of people pointed this out who weren't even fans of wrestling. It sort of became almost a mainstream news story of how weird wrestling looked without audiences. Like, this was something that was being put out there on mainstream entertainment websites and things like that, because it heightens the kind of choreography of things when you can hear everything and you can see everything. That was a hurdle they had to overcome in the beginning, and I think that they have overcome it. But what I like about the one thing that I really enjoy about not having a crowd there, and I still don't think it's enough of a justification to keep them away, but it's the subtlety of some things. Like, you could never have done a lot of this Roman Reigns stuff with loud, noisy crowds, because there's a lot of nuance to what they're doing. And pro wrestling character work and, angles are not known for subtlety and nuance, just because it's that traditional idea of whatever you do has to be projected for the people in the cheap seats, right? So it's like grand theater where everything is big and exaggerated, even though you don't always need to do that anymore because you have TV close-ups and stuff, but it's still it's that old school mentality of you have to make sure that the guy in the back row knows exactly what the issue is between these two guys. That's not so much the case anymore, right? So these subtle things that they've done, the layered stuff with Roman and the Usos and Heyman and like even
Brian, not to cut you off, but I'd even go a step further and say that even if there were a way for people to like hear Roman, like if they projected it or something, Roman whispering these things at Jey Uso, the drama would not have come across as well in front of a live audience. I think they would have grown impatient with it and crapped all over it, and then we would have lost this really good storyline that we now have. It
became more of a TV product and less of a live audience product.
Totally.
It's very possible that could have happened, and I think and I'm drawing a blank to come up with examples, but I feel like things like this have been attempted before to one degree or another, but not really worked because you lose so much and you can't really hear what's being said and done, and it just feels like they're reaching for something. Whereas this time they really, really were able to do it, and it's unusual for wrestling. Like I said, I don't think wrestling needs to be as broad as it is in the days of the way the technology is now for the audience at home, but it's just that mindset of live entertainment where everything has to be big. And the no crowds kind of gave us a little break from that. So that's a positive for sure.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about some other companies. Obviously you've got AEW that really came into its own. On one hand, their first full year, And they started off with a bang. They got renewed, I think, for 3 more years in January when they were only a few months into their run with Dynamite. And you've certainly seen stars created in AEW over the year. We had a title change relatively early in the year with Jon Moxley, and Moxley went on this huge run. Orange Cassidy became kind of a breakout star in AEW. And it goes on and on. FTR debuted. They had some terrific some of the best tag team matches in recent history in AEW. And Cody's done great work. On and on. Ratings have held pretty steady. They've maybe too early to declare a winner, but they have consistently beat NXT on Wednesday nights throughout the year. What do you, Harry? What do you make of the year AEW had? Is it all good or kind of a mixed bag?
I don't think it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's so tremendous that a company out of the chute has had such a successful first complete year. It's really amazing, and I'm really excited about this current angle with Kenny Omega, AEW champion, going over to Impact Wrestling. That's probably the outside of WWE equivalent to the Roman Reigns angle, where you look at wrestling a little bit differently. So what were their latest viewing numbers? Like over 900,000 viewers
for the big special with Sting's debut.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
They did over 900. It was the best number, certainly of the pandemic era. Yeah.
Right. Because when they started out, their very first episode was over 1 million. So if you could have an AEW like flirting with 1 million viewers every week, that would be tremendous. And also, when you watch Impact Wrestling, how the AEW World Champion is treated, it's almost like that champion is the champion outside of WWE. Like we have 2 different universes, and I can almost see other promotions kind of jumping on board and recognizing the AEW title as a world title. So people have asked, what's the benefit to AEW of this recent angle? I think that's one of them, that it's portraying itself as the, number one outside WWE, because even on the Impact Wrestling broadcast, they allude to it as such.
Yeah.
Now, there were some things in AEW I haven't really quite understood. The Dark Order, and the fact that they're still around in their current form, I've had difficulty with that. But it's hard to nitpick. It's hard to nitpick a company to do this much so soon. So I won't be so much of a critic.
Yeah. And certainly some of the stuff that WWE sometimes gets flack for in terms of comedy and again the cinematic kind of presentations. AEW has sometimes gone even further than WWE has, and not everybody's loved it. I mean, I think back to Jericho and MJF having their little song and dance skit, mixed reviews on that one. But Kevin, I mean, as editor-in-chief here, to some extent, you're sort of the arbiter on what is a major wrestling company and not. I mean, we designate who deserves a world title designation and doesn't. Did it feel like in 2020 AEW absolutely arrived, and is there a big 2 right now in the United States like there was 20 years ago with WCW?
Right. So I mean, they're not at the level WCW was in 1996 yet. I mean, they're simply not. They're not week to week. I mean, they're not beating Raw. Like they had some demographic victories over Raw. A couple weeks last week, the week before. But consistently just not the presence WWE is yet. However, I mean, the closest we've had, even when you had Impact as TNA with throwing everything they had at WWE, when you had Hulk Hogan show up, you had Eric Bischoff, all these stars there, all this money behind it. They might have even had a higher rating a couple of times, but it wasn't consistent. It fell away pretty quickly, and the product just wasn't up to that same standard, even if they did have the ratings. So I think it is closer than we've had. And I think just the fact that it is doing so well speaks to a couple things. And one is, I mean, let's be honest, they have a lot of funding behind it. If you look online, we're being funded by AEW as well. Tony Khan's paying for all this, which news to me. But that does not hurt. But I think there's also just this desire to see this exciting wrestling product that is the best wrestling could be. And is AEW perfect? Not by a long shot. There's a lot of problems there, like with any promotion. Even though they do so many things well, I shouldn't say a lot of problems, but there are some notable problems. The women's division needs a lot of work, and there are good wrestlers there, so I don't buy that. I don't think it's that people aren't ready. I think it's the booking. But then you look at something like the tag division, which is fantastic. They have a solid upper mid card. Their main event's great. So they do a lot of things very well. The match quality's been great. It feels like, there are some instances where I feel it apes the WWE style a little bit too much. And, just simple things like production. I mean, I tweeted earlier today about the music. Does every theme song from every wrestling show have to sound like a late 90s new metal song? Like it just feels very dated. Like it, or whether you like that style of music or not, there's a perception that that's old, and it makes something look old when it does it. But again, so many things are being done well, and I think they are filling that hunger that fans have had for this kind of product for so long. I always think back, I believe Conan said it on his podcast and I mean, he's had a few different podcasts. This is many iterations ago. It might've been the WrestleZone podcast, something like that. But he said, wrestling fans always seem to be so miserable, and like why they spend so much time talking about wrestling, but really they're talking about how much they don't like what they're seeing on TV. And I think it's easy to fall into that trap, especially when you're not seeing what you want and a company can do better. And he said that ultimately he thinks the reason that people watch is because they remember when wrestling was really great, and they think of those moments when, oh, this is the best thing I could possibly watch. This is the best form of, sports, entertainment, anything. And it makes me happy. And they're kind of chasing that high the whole time. And I think the AEW having this weight behind it, having this money behind it, this investment in it, and all these wrestlers just so eager to be a part of it, there's this belief that product can exist, and that in a way it's already does exist. And I think that's why so early on you have such consistently strong ratings for it. Again, even if it's not up to 96, 97 WCW levels, no show gets those ratings anymore.
Yeah.
And yes, there are absolutely arguments to be made that wrestling has taken more of a hit than other types of, because there are still, low-rated sitcoms will still get more than 1 million viewers per week. But we're looking at a pop culture landscape where there are more options than there have ever been before. It's far more competitive. People don't watch TV in the same way. So while it's important to keep an eye on these ratings, and it can be an indicator of success, it's not the whole picture. And I think a company that's not WWE consistently getting now close to 1 million, I think it's in the 990, or maybe not 990,000, but 940,000 every week. That's nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, it's remarkable, and even more remarkable. I mean, WWE, what they were able to pull off in the pandemic, certainly impressive. But then you have to understand all the decades of a head start they've had in terms of resources and infrastructure. AEW is not even a year old, and that they were able to have the year that they had in 2020 with everything being thrown for a loop, right? I mean, they had plans I had tickets for what do they call Blood and Guts, was their version of War Games in Newark and New Jersey. It was supposed to be one of their biggest shows of the year and got canceled. Everything was canceled, right? So their year was completely thrown out the window. They had to kind of quickly put something together, landed on, what's it called? Daly's Place? And ran everything out of there. They were the first to put some wrestlers in the audience to kind of simulate a crowd reaction. Got some mixed reviews for that. I mean, you could question the safety of some of that, and then later in the year brought back actual fans. but that they were able to have the year that they did, big signings, creating stars, having great matches, having destination pay-per-views in the middle of a pandemic, not even being a year old. I think it's an absolute win. Brian, even though you and I throughout the year, we've talked about how, and again, some of this is sort of generational. We haven't loved everything that they do. So sometimes it does feel like their presentation is targeting very much a younger demographic. That's good. That's working for them. That's probably the right way to go. But it also, I don't know that it works with everyone. I mean, I certainly, a lot of the matches that I saw get these 6, 7, 18 star ratings throughout the year, I watched and was like, all right, enough. Does this match really need to be 48 minutes long with 125 near falls? But Brian, what did you think of are you as gung-ho on AEW as everybody else here?
Well, here's the thing. You have to remember, too, that when we were kids watching, they were also marketing it to kids, except it just happened to be us at that time that they were marketing it to. And I say this a lot about things like Star Wars, too, and stuff like that. When you get these 40-year-old men that are all like up in arms, it's like, dude, let the 11-year-olds enjoy this. Please just let them enjoy this. So I try not to get too caught up. I mean, I know a lot of what we do is to criticize, but I have two thoughts about this. One is that, I've been watching stuff for so long in my life that it gives me more perspective. I feel this way about Saturday Night Live too, which I've been watching about as long as I've been watching wrestling, about 35 years now. And I'm like, I can remember basically the entire time that I've been a fan of both of those things. There has been a large segment of the fan base saying that it sucks and that it's not as good as it was. Now
I'd like to do like a side SNL podcast with you.
Well, because the thing about it is, I don't want to just talk about SNL, but it's the same as wrestling, where now you have people going, oh my God, yes, during the Phil Hartman years, Dana Carvey, or when Chris Farley was on the show, and I'm one of those people. I'll say, the late 80s or early 90s, that was the best time ever for SNL. But there were people watching it then, large numbers of people that were saying this show has not been good in 15 years.
Right.
They were saying it then. It's the same thing about wrestling. I was working for WWE at the tail end of the Attitude Era, and there were people, everybody now is like, oh, that's when wrestling was great. There was large segments. I would say like half the fans then were like, this is garbage. This is terrible. It was so much better when you had Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan and the Four Horsemen, and it's always been like that. So I think we have to have a little perspective. Like, if you listen to all those people, then none of this stuff has ever been good. But the other side of it is, I also have had to separate, and I've said this before, what I enjoy and what's good for business. Like, you have to separate those two things, especially the longer you watch and the more you kind of take an interest in the business end of things. I know what I love about wrestling. For me personally, my favorite thing, it's not the only thing I love. My favorite thing has always been the suspension of disbelief. And the fascinating thing about wrestling being like this sport that's not a sport. It's sort of like apes being a sport. And you're trying to think, well, what's real and what's not real? What is it? Like, those are the things I've always loved about wrestling. So that's why sometimes the more artificial stuff turns me off. But by the same token, I have to acknowledge what draws, what makes money, what people like to see, what gets ratings. And that's why I've always, and Meltzer too, and reading them over the years has opened my eyes up to that too, where you have to step back sometimes and say, this is what people want to see. And if you just listen to, the Ole Andersons of the world or the Jim Cornettes of the world, who, I may agree with them on some things. Sometimes you may go out of business listening to those people, because you have to think about what's going to make money. And so I think that gives me a little perspective. I know that wasn't all about AEW, but I mean, I
think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
It's a lot of it, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting contrasting that against what we saw from the NWA this year, and not to spend too much time on the NWA, because they didn't have that big a place in wrestling, certainly after the pandemic. But Harry, I'd be interested in your thoughts. How much room is there in a world like where we have AEW and where they're really kind of pushing the product ahead, WWE is also kind of trying to reinvent what wrestling is. I'd say in the wrong direction in a lot of ways. But then for some old fogies like us, here comes the NWA, which is just sort of unabashed nostalgia. And again, just catering to the old farts, exaggerating somewhat because they actually helped develop a lot of new talent that now you're seeing
this is
break out in
territory.
AEW.
This is dangerous territory, teeing Harry up for the NWA. We could.
Oh my gosh! That's when I realized wrestling had all 31 flavors of ice cream.
Yeah,
we had everything, and I loved it so much that I was like, this is too good to be true. Now you're bringing back the NWA World Television title. It's like identical. Like, I don't even think they straightened out like the copyright issues. Didn't it still say CBS, ABC, NBC on the plate?
It did, yeah.
But if I can critique the NWA just a little bit, since you brought them up, and this was especially true when we sort of entered the pandemic, where it sort of became a tongue-in-cheek parody of what the NWA used to be.
Yeah.
A little bit too much comedy. So in a perfect world, I would have loved the NWA even better if they had played it completely straight.
Yeah, more Nick Aldis, less the question mark and Aaron Stevens and some of the
maybe the degree. I love the question mark as a concept. Maybe just the question mark. I did think Aaron Stevens was overly cowardly, overly comedic. And, then you throw in the fact he's the national heavyweight champion and he's behaving this way. He's trying to do karate. It was a little bit too much at once. And so if NWA Power ever comes back, I'd like to see a little bit more of a serious approach there.
It's really such a heartbreaker. I mean, of every all the ramifications of the pandemic, I think that's been, at least personally, one of the hardest for me as a wrestling fan is that NWA was just stopped in its tracks. Because remember, they were building toward the Marty Scurll Nick Aldis match, and with an incredible set of promos that they had leading up to that match, the high stakes match that they had booked. The biggest arena I think they've had to date for the Crockett Cup show, and all of it just up in thin air. Speaking of Marty Scurll, maybe a good transition to the next topic. Some of the more unpleasant things that we dealt with, Kevin, in 2021 for sure was the problem raised by a lot of women wrestling about sexual improprieties by mostly male wrestlers, but there were some accusations the other way too. How much of a stain was that on wrestling in 2020, and how much of it has been resolved? How much in a better place are we now than when some of these allegations came to light earlier in the year?
Yeah, so I want to be careful talking about this because from a legal standpoint, these are allegations until they're proven in court. I happen to believe a lot of these allegations. Could even say most of these allegations, but legally speaking, they are just that right now. I will say, just from a practical business standpoint, I mean, you mentioned the Crockett Cup being canceled because of COVID, and that is true. But the NWA really kind of temporarily, at least, dissolved after Dave Lagana was named in the Speaking Out movement. And I mean, it's rebounded a little bit since. They have the Shockwave program, which pulls from the UWN program, which is, it's part NWA, but it also draws a lot of talent from Championship Wrestling from Hollywood and Las Vegas. So you have practical ramifications like that. You have someone like Marty Scurll, who, though not released by Ring of Honor, also hasn't been appearing on the show.
No, he's MIA.
Yeah, he'll be in a video package maybe in passing, but I mean, he's not in the ring. And I mean, even just from a practical standpoint, I know that this movement began when we were smack in the middle of the PWI 500. And we had to figure out how to do that. And we ultimately kind of landed on, well, if somebody's still with the company, we presume their job is safe and they're going to be pushed, and we're going to leave them in there for now. And then if somebody was like, oh, well, we don't know if they're going to work, we kind of treated it as like if a wrestler was suffering from a long-term injury and we didn't know when they were going to come back, a lot of times we'll give them sort of an incomplete and not rank them. And that's sort of what we did. Was that the right way to do it? I don't know. I mean, I look, even editing our year-end issue, I grapple with, well, should we phrase this differently? You have to be very careful. And I mean, because it is such a sensitive topic, there are legal ramifications around it. But I think, more important than that, it's very upsetting and triggering topic for survivors. So do I think anything has really changed because of it? I mean, that's tough. Short term, you had people lose jobs. Some people came back to work, some in even, big companies. Some haven't yet. Some other people were let go from some jobs only to show up on the independent circuit or try to resurrect their brand some other way. And, they'll face pushback around it, but it's a question of how long that will last. Because if somebody is on, attached to one of these big promotions, some fans will stop watching, but most won't.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard outside of legal culpability. And in some of these situations, it's going to be maybe hard to get that. And I mean, there's a whole separate conversation about how courts are not necessarily friendly to survivors to begin with. It's difficult for someone, if they're lacking physical evidence, it's difficult for them to have their case heard, and I mean, it's I don't know. I think it's difficult to say what this would mean going forward. And I don't know that I'm qualified to say it, but I think it was necessary. It's good that it happened. And we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. The other major social issue in 2020 that I do think bled into the product on TV was the whole reckoning on racial injustice. Brian, I'll ask you about that. How much of that do you think did have an effect in what we saw? And, some of it seemed to be dealt with more behind the scenes than on television, but in here late in 2020, I do think you see more African-American performers highlighted than early in 2020 or even 2019. I mean, you see now Impact's got a black world champion. You see in WWE, you see the Street Profits holding the tag titles almost all year long. You see Big E getting a big push over in AEW. You see Will Hobbs get elevated kind of out of nowhere. So do you think there's been some course correction by wrestling companies because of what came to light over the year?
Definitely more than we've seen, which I think says a lot because.
And I'm sorry, I bring up the Hurt Business, also a big one in WWE, a major act that arose during the year after all this.
Yeah, and they're a great example because of the change. Because what I love about them is that they're not any kind of real stereotype other than the wrestlers are stereotypes, right? But it's not a racial stereotype. You could see that faction being a bunch of white guys or a bunch of, guys of all different races. They just happen to be black. And I think that's when you really can tell that something's changing, because it's the same thing that I've often said about movies, where people talk about how there's not enough representation. And when you do, I think we've crossed the line in a good way when you start to see movies where the characters just happen to be black. They're not gangsters, they're not slaves, they're not historical black figures. It's just the guy happens to be black, and it has nothing to do with the story. That's when you're talking about real change. And I think you're actually starting to see that in wrestling, which I honestly never thought we'd see, because in a lot of ways, it can be so backwards on things like this, or really, really behind the times. We even used to joke in the office that wrestling culturally is like 10 years behind the times. Like the Dudleys were doing the "what's up" thing, yes, like 10 years after that was a thing, right? Like things like that. Wrestling is behind. And even in this, they're behind. Let's be honest here. But they are trying to catch up. And it's like with anything else, what finally makes the difference is money, right? The fear that you're going to lose, that you're pissing off so much of your audience that it's going to hurt your business. And that's what makes change happen. Unfortunately, it has to come to that. But whatever the reasons, I've been liking what I've been seeing, seeing things happening in a positive way. Just the fact, the exchange between Big E and The Miz on, I forget what it was, Talking Smack or one of those shows where, it felt very real. I'm very cynical when it comes to wrestling. I don't know how much of that was worked or scripted, where you have Big E, where you have The Miz saying like, all you have to do is work hard, that classic like privileged white guy thing. And Miz saying, wait, hold on a second. It's very easy for you to say. And it's almost like he was saying, without saying it, he was saying, hey, Miz, if you were black, you would not be here right now, given like your skill set and your talent. Like you would have to work a lot harder to be who you are. That was kind of like the message that was being put out there. And the fact that that was allowed on the air, and not only allowed, but acknowledged, and that they played it up and it was put on social media, I thought was very refreshing. I really hope it wasn't a work. I hope it was an organic conversation. But even if it wasn't, the fact that they let it go, that they let it happen and didn't try to hide it, is a huge thing. And you guys know the exchange I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. And I do think that was sincere. I don't think that was, if only because I don't think that program is even on Vince McMahon's radar. So
that's probably why it happened.
Yeah.
Well, there is that. It's implicit too in the Sasha Banks and Carmela feud. Although some of that with them is also that Sasha Banks is a wrestler, came up through the independents, and Carmela was a performance center product. But there's a certain amount of, hey, I was just given this, and I'm lucky, and you have to work for everything. So even if the Big E and Miz conversation was organic, which it probably was, they're tapping into some of that same energy. And I think as long as it's, done appropriately and not, doesn't become, offensive and punching down, I think it's, it's a good thing.
Yeah. But I agree. I think it's really heartening to see, and they still have a ways to go, as do all of us, in addressing some of this. But you think about how this would have been dealt with a few years ago. Yes. If there was this reckoning. I think Vince McMahon would have looked around and say, all right, who's black? You're the new world champion, right? And that would have been the wrong way to do it. And you see the way it's worked now is there's been a real recognition of, all right, who has maybe not gotten the breaks that they deserved, who has everything, brings everything to the table, but maybe we've overlooked for the wrong reasons. And then you see a Big E, who I think a lot of people have seen something in for years and years and years, even maybe predating the New Day, when he was just kind of the muscle for Dolph Ziggler. You see this huge imposing guy with
supposedly even back then, Vince was huge on him at that point.
Yeah, but what became of that, right?
Yeah.
Or the Hurt Business is a great example, because you look at everybody who is in that, right? I mean, there's a whole story there, maybe with the exception of Lashley, who has gotten a lot of breaks, but Cedric Alexander and MVP and Shelton Benjamin, who's, a lot of these guys are in their, 3 of those guys are in their 40s now, right? Yeah. And a lot of missed opportunity and wasted time. Watching Cedric Alexander, who I've liked. I got to interview him for the magazine a couple years ago when he was Cruiserweight champion, and it meant a little more to be Cruiserweight champion. And I was just so super impressed with the guy, everything about him. I mean, just such a consummate professional, and great in the ring, and could talk, and has some charisma, all that. I mean, smaller, and that's always been an issue, but checks so many of the boxes, and you just see him floundering, doing nothing. And now you see him looking sharp with the suit, having this attitude, tagging himself in to get the pin. It's great. The Hurt Business in general, I think, really have been one of the great breakout acts of WWE of the year. And I think, as you touched on, Brian, I remember when the rumors first started coming out that this group was coming together, and you remember what the reports were, is that there was going to be a new Nation of Domination. That's what was coming out. Like WWE is thinking about kind of get a new take on the Nation of Domination, and that's not at all what it was, right? As you touched on, I mean, the fact that they're, and it's not that it doesn't matter that they're black, because it does. It adds something to the act, right? To see 4 badass, tough, well-dressed black professionals And I even like that they were made heels, because it's not sort of like this pandering kind of thing, but it was just like, take these guys seriously. For as terrible as the Retribution angle was, I loved when it was the Hurt Business that kind of stepped in and said, you know what, we got this. And they went in there and they cleaned house. I mean, it was one of the highlights of a terrible angle and kind of a bad year. So, kudos to WWE. And actually, AEW's gotten in some ways more of a bad rap here than WWE. I think in part because they've put themselves out so much about being the progressive wrestling company, and then you look at the who's in the top spots there, and there is some diversity. But you didn't see a lot of African American faces in that top mix. I think they're trying to course correct some of that. Right. Harry, I'll ask you. You've been watching for a long time. What do you think of the job AEW has done addressing some of this and wrestling in general, the wrestling business?
Yeah, I mean, I think of what Brian said about how wrestling has been traditionally backward looking, but wrestling is also uniquely able to pivot than other industries. You look at Hollywood and how they're trying to get more people of color in leading roles in movies. And it's harder for them to do because, at least in wrestling, the scripted nature of it and the personalities we're talking about are already familiar to us. So it's not that much of a stretch to see Rich Swann progress to being the Impact Wrestling champion, or Big E to get the main event push, because like you say, he's been around for years. So it's felt a lot more natural in wrestling, more so probably than Hollywood or Madison Avenue. I was just thinking that accepting Rich Swann as a main eventer was a lot easier for me to take than, say, taking Bradshaw going to JBL seriously at the time. And I think of, like, the horrible history in wrestling, Burrhead Jones, Pork Chop Cash. Oh my gosh, how far we've come. Now AEW, precisely for the reason that you said, it touted itself as, being a proponent of diversity in wrestling, but it's been falling back a little bit. Our friend Duke from the Duke Loves Wrestling podcast, he's on their case every single day about this. But again, I guess it's a matter of patience, just give them a little more time, but they are a step behind. They're a step behind WWE and maybe even Impact.
Yeah. I think they've taken a lot of these steps to really bold in their presentation of diversity, that they kind of missed a big part of it, right? So they have, a transgender female champion, and they've got Native American stars, and they've got an act like Sunny Kiss. And in the meantime, it's like, well, you also don't have a whole lot of, black faces there in your top mix. It gets harder and harder to get away with that, just because we know that the talent is there. You see terrific talent. One to mention, and maybe this is a transition, Ring of Honor, they've, between Jay Lethal and Jonathan Gresham and Shane Taylor, they're doing an okay job too, and maybe in some ways before some of these other wrestling companies were ahead of them. Jay Lethal's been their top guy for a number of years now, less so in the last couple of years, but and it's, I don't know if folks even noticed, right? So Kevin, how about everybody else? So, not spend too much time, but Impact, Ring of Honor, both struggled in unlike AEW and WWE and even New Japan, the companies with bigger resources, they're still playing in front of crickets, right? And Ring of Honor just had the biggest show of the year, Final Battle. And I know, Harry, you said it didn't bother you too much. I still very much notice it. I think it hurts when I think it's hard to put on a match that has a big match feel when it is just pin drop quiet. What do you think? On the other side of that is just looking objectively at the product, both Impact and Ring of Honor, and Ring of Honor being shut down a lot of the year. But what they've put on, I think, has been pretty well received, and they've had a good product. Impact, in particular, I think had a pretty good year, even if the numbers aren't really there to back that up too much. What do you think of the job those two did in 2020?
So Yeah, I mean, I think they both made some strides and did some. I will say both of those companies were very careful. So Impact kept actually never really stopped. So Impact taped a bunch of shows ahead of time, but they never really didn't have a new product to put out. And part of that is because of this, they tape in bulk. And obviously they've had to tape without an audience, but you can see that they're really careful about it. They tend to have, the same people at the tapings and have people work a bunch of different matches. They'll bring somebody in for a few weeks and then they won't necessarily be there again, but it's probably partly to limit the amount of people who are there. No live crowd. And yeah, it's a little off-putting at first, especially because, you're used to seeing it as something different. And maybe you don't have that big visible crowd who's in every shot the way you do in WWE. But, that crowd noise was important and it was noticeable at first. And just, from so many of the wrestlers have said, there's this shock of like, I think Brian Myers told you in your conversation, taking that first bump without a crowd to react to it and give you that shot of adrenaline to rebound from it. But I think some of that is compensated for an Impact because they've done some of these, backstage segments. I think the Wrestle House stuff, very over the top, but I think it was at least very well written and well executed. So I enjoyed it. And I think Josh Matthews and Madison Rayne have stepped up in a big way as commentators. They're a little more in your face style. And I know some people are not so into that. They would prefer wrestling commentators to lay back a little more, but I think it's really done a good job of covering for that lack of crowd, just having that, constant storytelling going on. And Impact really did turn a corner this year because you have, a product that you always say that TNA stink on it. But around Slammiversary, the tides started to turn a little bit. And I know we've talked about it even on this podcast before, you and I, but it really has improved quite a bit. They're doing a lot of things well. The Knockouts division is fantastic. The tag team division has improved quite a bit. The North were a big part in that. And then, of course, you have Rich Swann and a lot of other singles competitors stepping up during this time. Willie Mack earlier on in the period. Rohit Raju as X Division champ. TJP and that's, in that same regard, and Chris Bay. So lots of things to like there. And then Ring of Honor, arguably has been the safest and most careful out of anybody. Mm-hmm. It had that bubble. I know Joe Koff came on the podcast and talked to you about that a while back, that they really wanted to make sure they were safe to return before they returned. They did come back a little bit before MLW did. So they weren't the very last to come back as far as the major independent promotions the major promotions in the US go. But then you look at, on top of that, they had people advertised for that card. I mean, they had EC3 advertised. They had a 6-man tag title match advertised. Matches that if they were less scrupulous, they could have very well gone ahead with. But they canceled them. And they did so because it wasn't safe. I don't even think all those people maybe they were exposed or they were asymptomatic, but I mean, they knew this because they were testing all the time. And they were requiring people to quarantine. And I mean, they really should be applauded for that. And then you have something, I know Harry was a big fan of the Pure title coming back, and that's been a big focus of their programming and them setting themselves as this more sports-like presentation that AEW supposedly was going to be doing, but it's, hit and miss whether they actually do that. And then Final Battle, I thought was a great show. I made sure to catch that one live. I thought it was very entertaining. It wasn't straight sports-like presentation. I mean, you had the Brian Johnson, Danhausen match, which sort of had the push and pull there and a little bit of silliness attached to it. Some fun had throughout. You have Dalton Castle, not so much in the ring. In the ring, he's business, but his presentation, So, and then, of course, you have PCO, who's just wild. So I think they have a nice balance, and I think there's a lot to like about Ring of Honor. I'm really curious to see what they do in 2021. And I really should single out too, since he was mentioned earlier, Jonathan Gresham. Man, he has had, despite the pandemic, despite being inactive for a while, he's incredible. One of the best technical wrestlers on the planet right now, I think, and dual champion in Ring of Honor, which, the big things from him in 2021, I think.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about 2021. Brian, what are you looking forward to? How much optimism do you have? I mean, obviously, some of this is going to depend on some things completely out of the control of any wrestling promotion as far as the pandemic goes. But are you optimistic that 2021 is going to be an improvement over 2020?
Well, I'll tell you, I was feeling more optimistic until Harry brought me down before by saying that we'll be in the same boat a year from now. So I'm trying to regroup from that. No, but I mean, the reality is that could very well be the case. I'm hoping that 2021 isn't just going to be like 2020 part 2. Everybody, because we have this sort of fake, psychological game we play where we think like January 1st, we're in like a different realm. It's just the next day, right? Let's not get too carried away. And I'm hoping that things get better. I mean, I do agree that, maybe, I'm going to say maybe by next fall, maybe we could have, live crowds again. That's kind of what I'm hoping. But I mean, the reality of vaccines and the way they work and all that. And, I, unlike many people, do not consider myself to be a microbiologist based on watching YouTube videos. So I can't really say. I'm going to let the experts decide that. But there are things that I'm hopeful about from a creative standpoint. I love the Impact and AEW crossover, and I hope it's a sign of things to come. I mean, I'm hoping that it gains momentum, and I'm really hoping that, you'll wind up with WWE and then the rest of the wrestling universe, almost like a Marvel Cinematic Universe thing happening with other companies coming on board. I mean, how amazing would it be if they were able to create something like that where it's like WWE versus the rest of the wrestling business?
So WWE is DC in this scenario? Is that?
I guess so. Yeah, I guess they would be. I mean, somebody posted this meme that was hilarious where it was like the end of Avengers Endgame, where Vince McMahon or WWE is Thanos, and all the other characters popping up is like, it's like Ring of Honor, New Japan, Impact, AEW. And I mean, not that I'm saying that's going to happen, but I love this idea of cooperation between the promotions. I hope we see more of that. I hope we see the creative team at WWE taking their lead from things like the Hurt Business and Roman Reigns, Tribal Chief, and that's seeing things that actually work and getting some freedom. I do think that they're stuck in the sense that like they're kind of stuck with Vince McMahon. I mean, I hate to put too fine a point on it, but as long as, if he's able to say, I trust people to run this thing and things are working that I may not like, if he's able to make that leap that I made, things are working creatively, even though I don't like them, so I'm going to let them go on, then I think you could be seeing a turnaround year for WWE, hopefully. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess. That's all I can say.
Yeah. What's discouraging right now is that NXT is not setting the world on fire, right? So I think for so long, the hope was that NXT would continue growing and thriving and be providing evidence for why it was time for a different vision, and maybe to move Triple H into that role where he is the vision for WWE. But now, with them losing consistently week in and week out against AEW, it becomes harder to make that case, and it almost sort of like bolsters Vince McMahon's position as the vision for WWE proper, for Raw and SmackDown, because NXT is not doing that well either. And a lot of the call-ups, and this is not their fault at all, but you hear stories about them bringing up Keith Lee, another, by the way, terrific African-American performer who more than deserved a shot this year. But you hear him, sending him back to get more experience because maybe his conditioning is not where he would want it to be. And it's discouraging, and it sort of removes hope for that next chapter, for WWE turning that corner and shakeup that I think a lot of fans think is needed. Harry, how about you? How much optimism do you have about 2021 being much different or better than 2020?
I think 2021 will be the same, but much better, because now we've had almost a year's practice, operating in a pandemic. I think a key moment will be the next WrestleMania, comparing that to WrestleMania 36 and to see the advances they've made, even though this year's WrestleMania was mighty impressive, considering that was one of the first major events out of the gate during all this. So I think in that sense, it'll be much better. As far as crowds, like I said before, I don't think we'll be seeing big crowds, but maybe, if we can do like 75, 100 people, that'll be something.
I think it'd be more than that. I mean, AEW is doing more than that now. Right?
Yeah. So if that happens, maybe we'll kind of lose this thing that we're watching wrestling that's not really wrestling. It's something else in the meantime. But I really have high hopes for 2022. I just feel like, we're just heating up, and at that moment,
2022. So you're skipping a year.
2022. I'm already moved past 2021, and that's what I'm really keyed up for.
What do you think WrestleMania looks like? I mean, there was so much talk about that. I remember with Brian and I in the weeks leading up to this year's WrestleMania, because it was unthinkable that you would do it in like an empty arena. Now, because some things have changed, is it just a Thunderdome WrestleMania? Do you expect that there'll be, a few thousand fans there?
I think it'll be something different. I don't think it'll be in the Thunderdome. It'll be in the Super Thunderdome, something like that. I think it's going to be something we're going to marvel at, because they've had well over a year to get used to this environment, and they've got plenty of experience. So I'm looking forward to it this year, even though I have to admit, WrestleMania 36, I had to watch it in bits and pieces. I was still traumatized. I could not watch, 2 nights, under those conditions. But I think this WrestleMania coming up will be much different.
Are there any obvious matches that you think we'll see at WrestleMania?
Well, I guess as much as I want to see the bloodline come together, it could be Roman Reigns versus Jey Uso. I mean, you're talking.
Jey Uso. Do you think Roman Reigns versus The Rock is out of the question?
I
have a hard time seeing them do it in an empty
environment
arena.
Yeah, I think just only for that reason, that is a stadium event with 100,000 people there, truly. And if you give Roman another year to kind of cement this character, here we go, 2022 again. Maybe that's the marquee match, even though by that time, Dwayne Johnson, he'll be about over 50 years old, willing to do that.
Yeah. Kevin, it's worth also talking about the year for Pro Wrestling Illustrated, right? So we've talked so much about wrestling, and it was also a huge year for us. And thankfully, most of the news was positive news, but of course, for the departure of the legendary Stu Sachs after 40 plus years, we said goodbye to him early in the year. But then you coming on board as editor-in-chief, expanding from, is it 6 to 9 issues? Is that what we're doing now, right?
Yeah, 9 issues.
Yep. And you're trying new things. We run YouTube. We've got the weekly newsletter, the Tag Team 50, a brand new feature that we just unveiled. Looking back, what was 2020 like for you in this first year in this role, and what are you looking forward to for the magazine in 2021?
Yeah, and kudos to you again for the Tag Team 50 concept, because that ended up being a really, I think I'm very proud of how it turned out, but also we've been getting a lot of great feedback. People will disagree with this ranking or that ranking, but nobody has said, this is garbage. Why did you do that? Everybody universally seems to love this as an addition to the, as you call it, our trilogy of annual rankings. But to answer your question, I mean, it's been a joy and an honor. I never expected to be taking over maybe I dreamt of it in my wildest dreams, but never expected Stu to tap me to take his place. And when he asked me to consider it, there wasn't a question. I've spoken to Stu a few times. He actually briefly stopped in. He picked up his plaque because we announced on Twitter a few days ago that he's one of the recipients of this year's Stanley Weston Award for Lifetime Achievement. Very well deserved. And, we spoke for a bit, of course, at a distance with masks on. But it's been challenging, and it's been I don't necessarily want to get into it right here, but I've talked about it on Twitter, just some personal things going on with my family this year that have made this a difficult year, in addition to gestures wildly and everything else. But I think I've had the strength to deal with that because I've had this wonderful job getting to work with you guys and everybody else who's been with the magazine, everybody else who we've brought in. I've made connections. I mean, I never got to interact with our photographers all that much. And even though we're not hanging out in person just yet, we're certainly, talking online all the time and, having phone calls with people. And it's really been great. As far as what 2021 holds for us, I think we're going to have some announcements coming regarding world title recognition. And, that's not exactly sure what that is yet, but there's clearly been a call for us to make some considerations there. And I think we'll have to answer those one way or the other. One thing I can announce, just to give you a little bit of a scoop here, our next issue after the year-end issue, which will be our May 2021 issue.
The Referee 20.
Referees want to see it. And I do want to cover, I think referees definitely deserve more ink than they get, but we have to stop the list at a point. No, the return of the supercards concept.
Oh, that's great. I used to love that. So slight difference with this one, because there are so many promotions doing exciting things right now, particularly between this month and next month. There will be the individual stories will be a little shorter, but still have, those fun sidebars and lots of photos. But we'll be covering a lot more shows. And the next issue will be, the May issue will be, largely devoted to that. So I can announce that now. And I'll be talking to you guys more about that, writing for that, I'm sure, in the weeks ahead. I mentioned that'll include Wrestle Kingdom. I don't know, does that line up?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I don't want to give away the whole lineup just yet, but I mean, Triple Mania just happened, so that's probably going to figure in there. And, American promotions, we mentioned Final Battle. I don't want to give up the whole lineup. I just gave possibly away a few of them. So
you don't want to give up the whole lineup except for Triple Mania, Wrestle Kingdom.
There's a handful more. Wait till you see. It's going to be.
Yeah. That's great. It's exciting. Yeah. I mean, I think you've done a terrific job of moving the magazine forward while also kind of reaching into the past and embracing some stuff that is very much part of our legacy and has worked in the past. So excellent. Kudos to you. All right, we're about an hour and a half here, so I guess a good time to wrap it up. This was fun look back and look ahead. Thank you, gentlemen, for everything in 2020. It's been a pleasure working with all of you. I wish you and your families all the best. Happy holidays, a happy new year, all that.